So tell me about this new X-ray evidence. What is this evidence? What is it all about?
Well, it's called wide-angle X-ray scattering. It measures the amount of natural aging that is found in fibers. They had about a dozen pieces of linen of a known age, and the best piece of linen, if you will, that compared, it was taken from Masada, which is circa mid-first century. There's far more aging evident in fibers from the Shroud than for it to be only 700 years old, as the carbon dating labs would say.
What are some reasons to be skeptical of this new evidence?
The juxtaposition is it either is or it isn't. And if it's not authentic, then it must be the work of human effort. It must be the work of an artist somehow, some way. And yet there are no artistic substances on the cloth to account for the image. If this is a 14th century artist, then let's look at what 14th century art looks like. And let's see what these artists are capable of. And let's see if there's anything remotely similar to the Shroud.
My guest today is Russ Breault, who's been researching and lecturing on the Shroud of Turin for 40 years. He's the president and founder of the Shroud of Turin Education Project and recently published his first book called Shroud Encounter, Explore the World's Greatest Unsolved Mystery, that's available anywhere books are sold. He's also an expert on this new scientific evidence that supports the authenticity of the Shroud, so enjoy my interview with Russ. So tell me about this new X-ray evidence that a lot of people are claiming that it basically proves that the Shroud of Turin is 2,000 years old. What is this evidence? What is it all about?
Well, it's called wide-angle X-ray scattering. And what it does is it measures the amount of natural aging that is found in fibers, in fibers of other linen and other pieces of fabric. When you look at fibers microscopically, they look like a bundle of spaghetti. I have this example. The gentleman Liberato De Caro, who is with the Italian Institute for Crystallography. He's the one who published this in a peer-reviewed journal and his research using all this. And so he described when you look at fibers under the microscope, they look like a bundle of spaghetti. But over the course of time, there are natural breaks that occur in these fibers. So if you can imagine, if you drop it, these are going to break. You can break off a bundle just like this right here. So by measuring the amount of breaks that you see in these fibers, you can get a good estimate as to how old something is. And so what he did, they had about a dozen pieces of linen of a known age, either from the historical context or that they were carbon dated. And so they knew exactly how old these other fabrics were. And they measured the amount of natural aging in all these other fabrics and so that they could get a plot line. And then they compared the amount of natural aging in fibers from the Shroud. And the best piece of linen, if you will, that compared, it was taken from Masada, which is circa mid-first century. And so this was so what he said is that there's just not nearly enough aging, or should I say there's far more aging evident in fibers from the Shroud than for it to be only 700 years old, as the carbon dating labs would say.
Okay, so what are some of the reasons to actually be skeptical of these new findings? I mean, we're calling them new and everyone's sort of talking about, this is a sort of new scientific find. As we know now, it's at least a couple years old, the research is. And so, but what are some reasons to be skeptical of this new evidence?
Well, I would say that, people would be skeptical because this is not a technique that is usually associated with dating artifacts. The issue, I guess, I applaud researchers for trying to find interesting and creative ways, especially when there's no attempt to carbon date it. I mean, if the carbon date's wrong, as many people feel, well, why haven't we done another carbon date? And it's and that's a question for the Turin authorities to answer. But if you're going to try to get another method of dating other than carbon dating, then it's going to have to be techniques like these. So in other words, what we did here, or what they did, was to compare the amount of natural aging in these other cloths, and then compare it with other pieces of cloth from a known age that we've carbon dated, or we know the age from its historical context. So then you apply that same technique to fibers from the Shroud, and you look at, well, what best fits the amount of natural aging that we see in fibers from the Shroud, and that appears to be a cloth that they found in in first century Masada. None of these are guarantees. In other words, this is just a very interesting way to say, maybe something went awry with the carbon date, as many people do believe. The Professor Giulio Fanti, he published in 2013 something similar to this, although he was using spectroscopy and mechanical analysis to compare the amount of deterioration in fibers from other fibers, and by comparison, again using a similar methodology, he assigned a date range of 280 BC to 220 AD, 500-year range with first century right in the middle. And so all these do is suggest, that maybe there's something wrong with carbon dating, and maybe we need to be looking at this again.
We're going to talk about carbon dating a little bit more in just a minute, but I want to move now to a question. How does this new finding, like this new scientific data, how does it fit with the other things that we know about the Shroud?
The interesting thing about the Shroud is that you have two bodies of scientific research. You have a massive amount of data that was collected in 1978 when you had a team of 33 American scientists go to Turin. They have access to the cloth for 5 days, working in shifts around the clock, 120 hours, and they bring 10 tons of gear with them. And so they collect tons of data. And from this data, they were able to determine that the Shroud is not the work of an artist. And that's really significant. In other words, here you have this inexplicable image of this 5'10" bearded crucified man. And the juxtaposition is it either is or it isn't. And if it's not authentic, then it must be the work of human effort. It must be the work of an artist somehow, some way. And yet there are no artistic substances on the cloth to account for the image. And then you have a whole pattern of bloodstains which correlate with the wounds of crucifixion as described in all four Gospels. And so is it just animal blood? Is it paint? Well, no, it's not paint, and it's not animal blood. It's AB blood type with human male DNA. So now this plot thickens. Can you someone asked me, can we ever prove this to be the Shroud of Jesus? And the answer is no, because we don't have the DNA of Jesus to match it up. But here's what we can do: we can prove what it's not. And then you can decide what it is.
I want to talk about some of the assumptions that kind of go into these new findings about temperature and humidity and stuff. What are your thoughts on the whole carbon dating fiasco?
Well, you're right to call it a fiasco, is in the fact that, the 3 carbon dating labs were supposed to get, they were supposed to cut 3 different samples from 3 different locations. They cut 1 sample from the outside corner edge exactly where it had been held and handled hundreds of times over the centuries. Literally, you have a 14-foot long cloth, and it would be held up by clerics of the church, would hold it upright, grab it right at that corner where it was cut for carbon dating. 14 feet long, so you have 5 or 6 people up here on the platform holding it out for people to see. And this is how it was exhibited over 275 times from 1413 until 1694, when it was finally installed in the cathedral. So if you were looking for the worst possible sample location, you would pick from one of the 2 outside corners where it had been held and handled hundreds of times. And of course, that's what they did. So now we have 1 sample cut into 3 different pieces, and those were sent off to the carbon labs, and it's like, well, what could go wrong? And so then in 2005, published in a peer-reviewed journal, chemist Ray Rogers, he begins to look at thread samples from that carbon-14 corner and compare them with thread samples from the main body of the Shroud, and lo and behold, they're not the same. And so what is he finding? In other words, he finds cotton mixed in with the flax threads in that corner, but there's no cotton anywhere else on the Shroud. It's made out of flax. And he finds a madder root dye, some kind of a dye in that corner, perhaps to blend in the brighter, newer cotton threads to effect some kind of repair. So it appears that we have all the ingredients for some kind of a medieval reweave. And so if you take 1 sample and cut that into 3 pieces, you're only testing 1 sample. And so so because they violated the sampling protocol, we have a complete mess on our hands. And now, published in 2019 in Archaeometry, a peer-reviewed journal published by Oxford, you have researchers that been under the duress of a Freedom of Information Act. The British Museum oversaw all 3 carbon dating labs in 1988, and so the British Museum, they collected all of the results from all 3 labs and submitted it to Nature, which is a English journal for science journal. But for some reason, they didn't publish all of the data. So there was data that was purposely left out. And so finally, been asking it for 30 years. People have been asking that the British Museum would release all the data. Finally, they did. There were 4 investigators involved, but the primary one was a French researcher by the name of Tristan Casabianca. He spends 2 years analyzing this data, publishes in 2019, showing that if they had included all of the data and not kept some data out of it, they would never have passed these statistical reliability tests. And so now, when you add in the data that was conveniently left out, now it demonstrates to us that there's something awry with that sample. It's not homogeneous. There's something going on with that sample. And that was not published in 1989.
I think originally they were supposed to take samples from 7 different locations, and it went down to 3, then it went down to just 1. Like they only had 1 sample. That's not a representative sample. Like it's the definition of a non-representative sample of something. And I get it. Like you don't want to destruct too much of the thing that you're working on, but at the same time, like you can't really rely on testing one piece. And again, like you say, like that's the corner. There could have been repairs. There could have been people handling in that section. So it just, I don't really put much faith in that carbon dating.
Well, it's sad because, had they done it right, we wouldn't be in this kind of a pickle right now. And this leads people like this wide angle X-ray scattering and other things to try to figure out, well, we know that something's wrong. So is there another way that we can maybe date this cloth? And so these other techniques are very interesting and intriguing and suggest that something really is wrong with the carbon dating.
Yeah, so here's one actually additional reason based on this new research why I think that the carbon dating is false. The history that we know of the Shroud, it's in Europe for at least the last 700 years. But if these findings are correct, then it would have been, if it were created, say in the 700 years ago, then it would have had to have been kept in one of the hottest places on Earth to show the same amount of degradation that we see in the cloth right now. So what I think that does is show that the carbon dating, at least if it doesn't even show that it's 2,000 years old or dates back to Jesus, it shows us that the carbon dating, this is yet another big reason to think that the carbon dating is incorrect. What are your thoughts on that?
I think you said it perfectly. Yeah. I mean, because the amount of aging we see in the cloth doesn't match up with something that is purported to only be 700 years old.
Well, now let's kind of switch gears a little bit. And I want to ask you, you've been studying the Shroud of Turin for a very long time. Do you think that this is the authentic burial cloth of Jesus?
Well, I always say, I'm 95% there. I'll give 5% to the possibility that there's some incredible artist who predated Leonardo by several hundred years. We don't know who he is. We don't know how he did it, and he never did anything else. I'm pretty certain it's authentic. I mean, I come back to that either or proposition. It either is the authentic burial shroud of Jesus or it's not. And if it's not, well, then what is it? Well, then it must be the work of human effort. And yet the result of the Shroud Project, with all that data, they're saying it's not the work of an artist.
Could it have been, some sort of non-human intelligence that created this? So I'm not just talking about aliens. It could have been possibly demons. Could there have been some sort of other non-human intelligence that was involved in creating the Shroud?
Well, I would say, first of all, that I don't think demons would do anything that actually glorifies Christ, because people have come to believe that this is a testimony not just to the crucifixion, but also the resurrection. And it's so I don't think it would be any kind of a demonic thing. The extraterrestrial is obviously a question no one can answer that. But in terms of identifying, could this be Jesus? Well, I mean, yeah, you can throw out there and say, well, thousands of people were crucified. How do you know it's Jesus? Well, first of all, the crown of thorns, over 30 puncture wounds around the head. I mean, who else? As far as I know, no one else received the crown of thorns as a routine of crucifixion. It was a mockery for the man who claimed to be king of the Jews. And then he was scourged massively. Why was he scourged so badly? Because Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor of Judea, didn't want to kill him. First thing he tried to do, he sent him to King Herod, and Herod sent him back. And then he tried to trade Barabbas, and that didn't work. And so finally, he has him scourged brutally, hoping he wouldn't have to kill him. But in spite of being brutally scourged, the crowd were still crying out for his crucifixion. And then, as you know, was Jesus, according to the scripture, gave up his spirit around 3 p.m. Around 4 p.m, the Roman soldiers would come back by, and if anyone was still alive, and there were 2 thieves on either side of Jesus who were crucified, they took a large wooden mallet weighing about 15 pounds, shattered the bones under the knees, and so they break their legs to speed the process of asphyxia, the inability to breathe. But what does the scripture say? Well, when they came to Jesus, they noticed he was already dead. Therefore, they did not break his legs. Instead, one of the soldiers pierced him in the side with a spear, and out flowed blood and water, probably blood and the separation of blood and blood serum, which would look like water. So those are all very unique things that happened to Jesus specifically. And not to mention the fact that you have the image of a crucified man, died a criminal's death, and yet he's wrapped in a rich man's shroud. This is an expensive piece of fabric. It's made from a 3-to-1 herringbone pattern weave, doable in first century, using first century technology, but expensive. And therefore rare. What does the scripture say? Joseph of Arimathea, a rich man, purchased a fine linen cloth. So on the line, one right after another, everything correlates with the crucifixion of Jesus. And you have and in terms of the blood stains, you have a whole pattern of blood stains, but it's not painted blood. It's literally called the exudate from actual wounds. In fact, what we find in the blood chemistry is a very high bilirubin content, which is kind of a breakdown of the hemoglobin that occurs during severe stress. I think crucifixion might qualify, and then so the blood patterns correlate, the actual blood chemistry correlates, and then of course the image of a. And then the other thing too, what's really unique is that this image resides on only the top 1 to 2 microfibers, not threads, microfibers. In other words, each thread is made up of about 200 microfibers. So that means this image resides on about 1% of a single thread. And so, in other words, if you take the cloth and when you look at it, you see those parallel lines with scorch marks and burns and patches from the fire in 1532. And then you see water stains, you see blood stains. If you flip the cloth over, what you'd see the burns, you'd see the water stains, and you'd see the blood stains. But what you would not see is the image of the man. The image of the man is a purely superficial phenomenon affecting only the top 1 to 2 fibers of the inside of the cloth facing the body. So when you put all that together, and then you say, well, show me the artist who can do this. Again, if you assume the carbon data is correct, then you're looking for a 14th century artist. I wrote this book, it just got published in June, and chapter 9 is called the challenge of art history. If this is a 14th century artist, then let's look at what 14th century art looks like. And let's see what these artists are capable of. And let's see if there's anything remotely similar to the Shroud. And there's not.
I don't know if you know this. My background is in photography, and one of the things that really impressed me was the fact that the image on the shroud is a digital negative. So, well, it's not a digital negative. It's just a negative. And so the image that they've got on the shroud is like a negative. So if you flip it, if you take a negative of the shroud, then it looks correct. And so how would someone know how to do that all the way back then? It wouldn't have even crossed their mind back then, unless you've got someone who's like time traveling back to the past just to like screw with people. I feel like that's almost a better explanation than some of the explanations that I've heard. Even the alien hypothesis is better than some of the other explanations that I've heard. But let me ask you one last question as we start to wrap up here. I've seen some people say that they don't really even care about the shroud. Like, the shroud is very interesting, very puzzling. It's very mysterious, but it's nevertheless like not that important of a piece of evidence in support of Christianity, even if it's authentic. So what are your thoughts on that? Do you think that if we could somehow prove, you're at 95% certainty, but if we could somehow prove with 100% certainty that this was the authentic burial cloth of Jesus, in your mind, would that provide very good evidence that Christianity is true?
Well, I think it would be convincing to a lot of people, but you have your ardent skeptics that are not going to believe regardless. I mean, a committed atheist is a committed atheist, regardless of evidence. So I think it would speak to many people, but not to all. I would simply say this, if I can plug my book, it's called Shroud Encounter, Explore the World's Greatest Unsolved Mystery. And now, why do I say it's the world's greatest unsolved mystery? Lots of mysteries in the world: the pyramids, Easter Island, Stonehenge, the Bermuda Triangle. Why is this the greatest unsolved mystery? Because it relates to the greatest story ever told. What if the God of this universe really did send his only son into the world to become one of us, to become a human being, and to live a life that we couldn't live, a perfect life, and then submit himself to the extreme brutality of the cross, to literally become the perfect sacrifice, or as John the Baptist said, the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world? And what if he really did rise again on the third day from the dead, and then promises victory over death for all who believe? Would that not be the greatest story ever told? And is it possible that the shroud is a document of that very set of events? And I think that's about as big as it gets.